Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
We had the voice of Kailey Grieco with the questions that Tyler is presenting. We seek answers with the senior fellow for the Reimagining U.S. Grand Strategy Program at the Stimson Center. Kailey, it's great to have you back with us. From your perch as a military strategist and knowing what we have already seen, of course, take place in Ukraine, how impactful will this package be, if at all?
First, thank you for having me and Happy New Year. This is an expected aid package. It's an attempt by the Biden administration to send as much aid as possible before the next administration comes in. I think the impact it will have is more about trying to sustain current Ukrainian operations, and that will be helpful to some extent because we're hearing increasingly stories about artillery shortage in particular, but it won't do much. Ukraine is in a very difficult spot right now and is essentially slowly losing this war.
I spoke recently with Melinda Herring at the Atlantic Council on the prospect of buying different gear. And this came off of a question I was asking Melinda about a post that Elon Musk had made, suggesting we need to be investing more in unmanned technology, drones. This, of course, this conflict in Ukraine has reinvented the drone on a military level. Here's what Melinda Herring had to say about our purchasing requirements going forward.
Once the war in Ukraine is over, Ukraine is going to be the leading player around the world with naval drones and with long-range drones. And Joe, they have huge capacity. That's another story that's not getting enough play. So the Ukrainians in the last year have maxed up their drone capacity internally in Ukraine. And they could increase it by a 2/3 factor if they had more money.
What do you make of that, Kailey Grieco, the use of drones? Should we have been sending drones instead of other things like tanks and F-16s this whole time?
Well, I think the issue is we actually don't really have the drones to send, particularly the kinds of drones that Ukraine's using, these smaller quadcopters, these racing drones, and even some of these long-range drones at the price points and the way that Ukraine's using them. We just don't have those. Believe it or not, China leads this market. Most of the commercial drones on the market, if you were to go to Amazon and try to buy one, are made by a company called DJI. It's a Chinese company. So we don't have it to send. And this is actually an area where we are really behind China and is a national security concern. So I think we've been giving things that play to our strengths in terms of Ukraine. I don't think the F-16s was a wise decision, as we discussed, but things like artillery, anti-tank weapons have been very helpful.
I know you've had a very honest take on some of these programs, from the F-16s to the Abrams tanks. So let's talk a bit about what's about to happen. Donald Trump says he can solve this war on day one. We've seen a calcifying of lines in some areas. Some of Bloomberg's reporting would suggest that Russia's about to kick Ukraine out of the Kursk region. Who's got the stronger hand at the negotiating table?
Clearly, Russia has a stronger hand. As you suggested, they're pushing the Ukrainians in the Kursk region. They've captured about 40% of the territory that Ukraine took after August. And they're really pushing on Donbass. That's where I'm very concerned, is the Donbass region in particular. There's a major city in the center of Donbass region that's a major logisticals hub, and they're surrounding that, and it's likely to fall. And we're seeing in all areas that they're really just pushing that front in Donbass. So it's slowly but surely, they're taking territory. It's very costly, but they're slowly winning this war. And so the Russians know that. And I think that they're going to play a very hard game in terms of any kinds of negotiations. I don't think we can end it in 24 hours. I think there's a good chance we'll see a ceasefire this year, but not a real peace deal.
Fascinating. So that could take more time. With that said, are the lines in place now, the lines that will be drawn in a peace deal?
Yeah, I think that's, we've seen indications that that's probably going to be the case. Vice President Vance gave an interview in the fall where he suggested essentially a frozen conflict, freezing the territorial gains where they are. I think both sides recognize that. I think that's why, in particular, Russians are really pushing in the Donbass, even over Kursk and recapturing Russian territory. They're prioritizing Ukrainian territory to try to gain as much territory as they can before that freeze happens.
I want to ask you, Kailey Grieco, a little bit more about the DIB, as Tyler Kendall was just reporting, the defense industrial base. That was a big part of the debate here, right? Getting this money cleared was a big reminder for some Republicans who had an allergy to sending more money to Ukraine that most of that cash was going to stay right here in the U.S. to go to American-based defense contractors. But you just reminded us again of what we don't have. And in some cases, it's not just drones. It's old-fashioned stuff like shells, mortar rounds. What progress did this Congress make in fixing that along with our defense partners?
I don't think we made very much progress at all on these issues. There are a couple issues here. One is that if you look at the budget consistently, we talk about munitions, the fact that we need munitions, especially long-range missiles. But each of the services tends to cut the missiles in their budget and prioritize sort of the flashier, big spending programs. And so that's just an easy place where every year it gets cut. And so that's not helping in order to putting these kinds of purchases with companies so they actually build these missiles we need. And the other area I would just say is in terms of Ukraine is that the kind of systems that are needed to fight a land war in Europe are very different from what's needed, for example, in the Indo-Pacific, where it's primarily an air and maritime environment. So even if we are making more artillery, for example, now, which is the case, it's not going to be all that useful probably if there's an Indo-Pacific conflict. So we really need to think about where the defense industrial base needs to be scaled up and how to do that.
That's a big conversation. I don't know if you see this administration getting closer to the mark on that, whether it's working with the Raytheons or the Lockheeds or General Dynamics of the world. What do you think? Is that a different story under a Trump administration than Biden?
I think it is. And I'd say I'm actually a little optimistic about this, because one of the things we've seen is not for the big primes, the companies you mentioned. I don't know how well they'll fare under the Trump administration. But there are a lot of Silicon Valley people that are backing the Trump administration. We've seen some of the recent appointments to DoD leadership positions are being given to tech investors, defense industry executives. And so I think some of these newer startup defense techs are going to probably see a bigger role and access to actually more of the budget. And I think that would actually be a very good thing for the reasons Musk emphasized, particularly that we need more drones and uncrewed systems in the U.S. military. And these are the kinds of firms that can develop that and develop it quickly for the United States.
It's a really important point. As we spent some time with Kailey Grieco on the prospect for a peace deal in Ukraine, Bloomberg News sat down with Antony Blinken. Kailey, my colleague David Gura asked him about motivations at the bargaining table. Here is what we heard from the Secretary of State. This is just a couple of days ago on Bloomberg.
In his mind is the recreation of a greater Russia. And you don't have to believe me. Just read what he said. He's been very clear about it. He's failed in Ukraine. That proposition that he could erase Ukraine from the map, subsume it into Russia, has failed. And that's a result of the incredible courage of the Ukrainian people, but it's also a result of the dozens of countries that we rallied in defense of Ukraine.
Kailey, I won't ask you about the prospect of peace again, but you're a military expert, a military analyst, and I wonder if that is in fact his goal, the recreation of a greater Russia, what that means for Russia as a military presence and a superpower in the world.
Yes, I mean, it's clear that there's a notion here of some kind of greater Russia or at least increasing Russian influence in its traditional neighborhood. And there's particular sensitivities around Ukraine, in part because it's a natural invasion pathway into Russia, going back to the time of Napoleon. And so I think there is some truth to that. And I think the fact that Blinken is right, that he has failed in his goal in terms of taking Ukraine and bringing it into the Russian orbit. That has clearly failed. My criticism, though, to Blinken and the Biden administration is that it endorsed Ukraine's maximalist aims in this war of taking back every inch of territory and returning to its 1991 borders when that was never a realistic option. I wish they had been sending that message a lot more, that this was actually a victory for Ukraine and actually not falling in 4 days. And perhaps if they had really gone more in that direction and been a little bit more realistic about expectations of what could be achieved, Ukraine today would actually be in a better position to negotiate a peace.
We're out of time in 1 minute. Kelly, is all the money gone in this Congress for Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's gone. And the question is, will we ever see another bill like that? I'm not particularly optimistic.
I didn't think you would be. She's senior fellow with the Reimagining U.S. Grant Strategy Program at the Stimson Center. Kailey Grieco, thank you so much, Kelly, for a smart year of analysis here on Bloomberg. We really do appreciate your take, as we learn something whenever we talk to Kailey Grieco about, of course, one of the most pivotal stories of 2024.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
This is our New Year's broadcast, New Year's Eve, I guess. We're not going to be here tomorrow, so this is the last hour we're going to spend together at the end of a wild year in politics. Think of what we've gone through since the beginning of the year. From Des Moines, where we were packing our bags about a year ago right now, to Manchester, Super Tuesday, the early states, Butler, Pennsylvania, Milwaukee. Joe Biden drops out of the race. We're in Chicago. Straight through an election that turned so many expectations on their heads. And of course, it happened in a year in which we watched the Speaker of the House dispatched, fired by members of his own conference, and so much division that followed. When our great producers asked me, who would you like to talk with on the last show of the year? We didn't have to think very hard about it. I said, Frank. Frank Luntz, founder, CEO, FIL, Inc., political strategist. I'm supposed to say celebrity pollster too, right? Frank, it's great to see you. I hope the holiday season is going well for you. Happy New Year in advance. With everything that I just said, is our nation more or less divided now than it was at the beginning of the year?
Well, here's what's interesting. And you and I spent an afternoon in the freezing cold of Des Moines, Iowa. Your set was only 1 block from my hotel, and I almost didn't make it. And now we end the year still so angry, with half of America in disbelief and the other half celebrating, looking ahead to 2025 as being the best year ever. Are we divided? Yes. Are we polarized? Yes. Is there pressure to bring us together? Not really. Now, that said, let me give you 3 findings over the last few days. Number 1 is that Donald Trump's popularity, his favorability, is higher now than it was when he became president back in 2017. Number 2, there are groups within the electorate, particularly Latinos, younger men, union members, who are considering voting Republican more so now than they ever have in modern times. And number 3, the Democrats are divided as to what to do, how to move forward. And the only advice I can give them as we end this year is this idea of being the resistance is not what America wants. Even those that did not vote for Donald Trump don't want resistance. What they want is an alternative vision, an alternative approach. And everyone across America watching right now want results that they can count on, results that are both meaningful and measurable. That's what the American people are asking for.
Well, so then would it be a misstep for Democrats to not help elect a Speaker of the House on Friday, knowing that Mike Johnson has 4 votes to play with, Frank?
Well, Hakeem Jeffries is one of the best communicators in America today. And he has the ability to reach across the aisle. Whether he chooses to, the answer is probably no, because he has a different point of view than the Republicans. And it's not the job of the Democrats to help the Republicans. That said, it would be a shock and to tens of millions of Americans a disappointment if the Republican Party, after waiting this long to have a president, a Senate, and a House, end up tearing themselves apart. The American people want you to stand up for your convictions. They don't want you to give up on your beliefs, but they even more so want to get things done. On immigration, they want to solve the border. On prices, they want to do policies that affect affordability. and they're just tired of this yelling and screaming in Washington, D.C. That's the message that they need to take home this New Year's Eve.
Well, so are we going to find a Republican conference that is united on Friday? Of course, that's the intrigue right now, is whether we're going to have multiple rounds. Maybe Mike Johnson can't survive the Tom Masseys or Chip Roys of the world, depending on how they end up voting. Or is there some real discord inside this Republican Party, despite the mandate that Donald Trump talks about?
There is discord. And when your majorities are barely over a minority, you have nothing, you have no give. And the fact is that the public does support most of the Republican positions. But mark my words, you can play this tape again, December 31st, 2025. If they do not solve the border issue, if they do not bring down and permanently address affordability, and if they continue to fight among each other rather than get stuff done, the public will punish them. On the reverse, or on the contrary, if they do solve these challenges, you can see a Republican majority for years to come.
Producers are pulling that cut right now, Frank, to play back a year from now. When you consider what we're left with here at the end of this year, I can't talk to Frank Luntz without getting philosophical. I just walked through a couple of pretty wild stages that we all experienced in the world of politics this year. They included 2 attempted assassinations. Of course, a lot of arguing, Frank, and a lot of uncertainty as we went into this election. What is the electorate left with? How do we feel? Where are the bruises and the wounds that could be exposed in the new year?
We have okay, I'm going to just make everything worse. So if you want to be excited and optimistic, you need to, I don't want to tell anyone to turn off their TV or their radio, but this is not going to go well for you. We have a lower degree of trust and confidence in our institutions than at any time in 40 years. We do not believe we're being told the truth by the media, by journalists, by the politicians, and the various elites in America. And finally, we are of the belief that the country is seriously off on the wrong track, although those numbers have begun to change in the last 2 months. I've been doing this now for over 35 years and have not seen a time of more anger and division. But what concerns me the most is 2 data points. A third of America don't believe that they are invested in the future of the country, and 2/3 of America believe that their country is not invested in their own future. That is horrific. We need to address that, not just for right now, but for the long term, because in the end, our economic success depends on it. Our political, our democratic institutions depend on trust and confidence. We have to get to the truth, and we have to do so now, because we've done so much damage to our politics and to our faith and confidence in the future. It's time to turn that around.
Well, let's talk about who's invested in America, because as we've discussed, Frank, you spent a lot of time at West Point, and you've conducted some fascinating conversations with the cadets there, focus groups that we can learn a lot from. You just had one recently that I had a chance to watch, and it was inspiring. And you asked the cadets in the room, tell me what you love about America. Here's a sample of what Frank heard.
Tell me what you love about this country.
The values, that we are a country built on values. We all here, officers and the cadets, swear an oath to the Constitution, that not to a president, not to a leader, and that the standard in America, because we're based on values, is set so high that we're striving towards more perfection.
So you just mentioned the Constitution. This is the single greatest misconception I think Americans have, is that they don't realize that that's where your oath is. What does the Constitution mean to you?
America. The Constitution means America because the Constitution is the very soul of America. That's what it is. When the Constitution and its ideas were first written over 200 years ago, it was an experiment. It was an idea. They didn't know it was going to work. Just like with the Revolution, they had no idea if it was going to work or not. But they had the dream and they had the hope. And for me, that inspires my dreams and my hopes.
Our future leaders talking with Frank Luntz at West Point. Frank, short of our listeners and viewers all enlisting in the military on this New Year's Eve, what should they learn from this?
That there is a group of young people And I swore I was not going to get emotional because it's the end of the year. I want you to have me back. But they inspire me, and they should inspire the country. Service with character and sacrifice, a commitment to the Constitution, not partisanship, not politics, but the most important document in global history. These cadets work harder, train harder, and make a greater effort for the country, and they do so because they love their country. And they will protect each other, and they protect us. Let me give you one phrase, the Army-Navy game. I wasn't too happy about the outcome this year, but this is the only game that is played where the people on the field commit to defend everyone in the stands and everyone watching. The people on the field will give their lives for the people watching. That's West Point. That is what makes America great. And thank God and God bless these cadets, because they are the best of America.
That you can bring this to us, Frank. They are indeed. And this is why we wanted to talk with Frank Luntz on our final show of 2024.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
At this important moment in time, indeed, next month is going to be something. We're going to witness a lot of important moments together. Barbara Perry is no stranger to them, Director of Presidential Studies at the University of Virginia's Miller Center. She's with us now. Barbara, it's great to see you. Before we get into the throes of January here, I would love to get your take on that remarkable moment that we will witness, a presidential funeral, Jimmy Carter's funeral with Joe Biden, his friend, the first man in the Capitol to endorse him for president, delivering the eulogy. How fitting, in your view?
Very fitting, and I guess it does show the cycles of history and how one element so many years ago, so many decades ago, Joe Biden, and as he said in his remarks most recently after the president passed, he said, I told Governor Jimmy Carter that it wasn't going to really matter if I supported him because I was so new to the Senate at that time. But I just think that it ties those two men together in the old school of politics. Although Jimmy Carter was the fresh, new view and voice of politics in 1976, and so was Joe Biden, and so that the two should intersect at this moment and right before another historic moment of only the second president to be inaugurated for a non-consecutive second term. It's, for those of us who study history and presidential history, it's a real moment to reflect.
Well, and from the history repeats itself file, the idea that there would not have been a Ronald Reagan without Jimmy Carter, similar to the idea there would not have been a Donald Trump without Joe Biden. But of course, Barbara, there wouldn't have been a Joe Biden without Donald Trump. Won't that be going through your mind when you watch them both on the west front of the Capitol on January 20th?
It will, Joe, and I love to play out those what ifs. One little movement in history can reshape the world. I think it was Archimedes said, give me a lever and a spot of the globe and I can move the globe. And that's what this little series of steps or missteps, in fact, can cause a change in history. I've also been thinking about the fact that Jimmy Carter was unlucky enough not to have one appointment to the U.S. Supreme Court in his 4 years as president, one of only four presidents who fall into that unfortunate category as far as they're concerned. But he did name Ruth Bader Ginsburg to the Court of Appeals in Washington, D.C., which, as most people know, is a stepping stone to the Supreme Court. So in some ways, Jimmy Carter is responsible for Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And for those people who support her and what she did, you can say that's a good thing. But you could also say that what if she hadn't been there and therefore stayed on the court and therefore caused Donald Trump in a way to take over the court, all sorts of different decisions would be coming down from the court, perhaps. So great what if games. It's a parlor game for New Year's Eve.
As an historian, Barbara, what do you make of the fact that there is so little talk right now about January 6th? Denver Riggleman, the former congressman who was, of course, an advisor to the January 6th committee, was on the program yesterday. He said that goes for both Republicans and Democrats. Nobody wants to remember it. Nobody wants to relive it. And we're about to have the certification of the vote next week. How should we be looking at this for the first time in, well, since the riot?
First of all, former Congressman Riggleman was my congressman in the 5th District of Virginia, Charlottesville, where I'm based, although I'm in Louisville, Kentucky today. But, I actually don't agree with him on that. I think it would be as if we would say, no one talks about the Civil War anymore. Let's just put that behind us. Those who forget history are doomed to repeat it. Now, I'm not arguing that we will this January 6th, but I don't think we should ever forget what happened that day. But it appears that 70 plus million Americans decided to put that behind them and vote for Donald Trump.
Well, so is that just the process of compartmentalizing, or did half the country think that it was, in fact, a tourist jaunt through the Capitol?
I don't think half the country thought that. A major portion did. Perhaps that third or now maybe a slightly larger proportion of people who say Donald Trump can do no wrong and did think it was just a nice tourist trip through the Capitol. But I think the other proportion of people who voted for him decided that that was something they could put behind them and that it didn't bother them enough not to vote for Donald Trump.
Boy. It's really remarkable when you consider the national dialogue from 4 years ago as we now walk into the next January 6th. Barbara, Donald Trump will address the nation on that day, on the 20th, from the west front of the Capitol. What will he say?
Oh, if I were only a soothsayer, I could make a killing in predicting.
Well, we remember a pretty
games.
Dystopian speech on his first
Yes.
inauguration. Is that the Trump we're going to get?
I've given up predicting Donald Trump. I suspect a lot of that inaugural address will be formed by Elon Musk. And so, elements related to defense, elements related to America First, elements related to the common people. I think he'll be reaching out to them and saying that he's going to lower inflation and make America great again. And that's, I think, the theme that he will propound. But maybe it'll be in a slightly more positive vein than in 2017.
Think he goes into the White House and pardons the January 6th offenders on that same day?
I do. Yeah, he's said that that's what he's going to do. That I certainly believe that that's one of the truths that he has been propounding and that he'll make good on it.
So it's already in the water. I guess people won't be surprised. But how will that play nationally, having seen the reaction that we did, for instance, to Joe Biden pardoning his son Hunter?
It's sort of less personal, I guess you would say, for Donald Trump, in that these people aren't by kin or blood related to him. So it won't have that same impact. But on also the 70 plus million people who voted for Kamala Harris, and I presume many of those were very upset over what happened in the insurrection of January 6th of 2021. It will be shocking to think that those who so not only disrupted a constitutional process, but also attempted to tear down the very sacred precincts of our government and our politics. It'll be a sad day for them.
Well, we're about to see a new construct, if I can use that word, in this administration. And I picture Barbara Perry writing new chapters here on what it is to be the executive in this country. When you've got the Doge on one side, the Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy experiment that is not actually a governmental department, and a series of czars who are going to be setting policy above and aside, I guess, the actual cabinet officials who are confirmed by lawmakers on Capitol Hill. Is Donald Trump about to reinvent the presidency?
I think so. And you spoke of a chapter that I could write. I did write a chapter in 2017 and 18 that's in a book that is called The Presidency and the Constitutional Crossroads that we believed at the Miller Center that we faced when Donald Trump was first elected. And I think he's made, if you think of a crossroads analogy, I think he's made a complete turn in our presidency and as an office, but also in our constitutional construct. That the founding fathers created our system of checks and balances and balance of power, if I may use that term, of three branches of government that were meant to be more or less equal and that would check and balance each other. This concept of a unitary president, which is seemingly all powerful under Donald Trump, will utterly turn and upset and overturn, I think, the framers and their intentions to prevent what they had fought against in the revolution against the King of England, and that was concentrated power. So that would be the epilogue to that chapter and the start of a new chapter for me to write.
What does that mean if you're serving in Congress, if you're the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, or you're the leader of the Senate, John Thune? That means you don't have the power you thought you had, Barbara.
Well, we saw, for example, just recently, and you mentioned this in the previous segment about the budget negotiations just before Christmas, that there were members of Congress who stood up to the president and to Elon Musk. And they were members of the president's own party, those 38 Republicans who said, no, I ran on budget. It was discipline. So I'm not going to vote to raise the debt limit. So there will still be some people who will try to hold the line in Congress. And I'm not arguing that everything Donald Trump would put before it would get through. But you also have mentioned the pardon power, which is his sole power, executive order power, which is the president's sole power. So it's a bit worrisome for those of us who support the Constitution and those balances of power and checks and balances.
Well, let's get you back in 2025 to talk about it, because it looks like, based on this calendar, the news is going to be fast and furious, Barbara. It's been a wonderful year comparing notes with you, and appreciate all of your insights in 2024. Barbara Perry, Director of Presidential Studies, the University of Virginia's Miller Center. Thank you so much for being with us here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Balance of Power podcast. Catch us live weekdays at noon Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
I want to bring in the voice of Robert McWhirter in our closing conversation here on the broadcast, because we spent so much time with Robert this year talking about the legal travails of both Donald Trump and Joe Biden by way of Hunter Biden. He's a criminal defense attorney who could be a political analyst, I think, in anyone's book. Robert, it's great to see you. Welcome. There's actually a headline on Donald Trump's legal saga right now. The Federal Appeals Court upholding E. Jean Carroll's $5 million civil judgment against the president-elect. They wanted a new trial. Is he out of the woods?
No, he's still in the woods on that. I'm not sure when he will be sentenced on that, but the federal issues that he tried to raise going to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals were very, very weak. And this is still a state case, and the Federal Court of Appeals just wasn't going to wade in and help him from himself in this situation. So that's pretty much there. And I don't think the Supremes are going to take this one either.
Well, you and I talked about a lot of cases, Robert. There were four specifically, I believe. Of course, we had the Bragg case in New York. We went through the Jack Smith cases, if I can call them that at this point. We had Georgia, the documents, January 6th. My God, here we are. A couple of weeks before the inauguration of Donald Trump. Doesn't have a mark on him after all of that. Did the media just get over its skis on Donald Trump's legal woes?
Well, I think it gets a little complicated to keep them all straight. Look, the bottom line is him becoming the president-elect, and he's going to take office, of course, on January 18th, really kind of puts a wrench in going forward with the cases, at least for now. It's very hard to maintain a prosecution against a sitting president, although not impossible. Remember, back in the civil case of Paula Jones versus Clinton, the U.S. Supreme Court said that case could go forward, and that's a civil case. Presumably, a criminal case is more important and more public import, so they presumably could go forward. But I think what's going to happen is everyone's just going to put a hold on this. Jack Smith has gone ahead and resigned because he wasn't going to give Donald Trump the satisfaction of firing him. And everything goes on hold until Donald Trump is out of office, either at the end of his term or if Donald Trump is impeached again and then convicted in the Senate. All these cases come back for him to face.
Now, okay, what does that look like, though? So we freeze everything in our game of musical chairs here on January 20th. Which of these cases, how would they be pursued? Would you need a new special counsel, for instance, to go after Donald Trump on the documents case?
Well, you probably would, and also the January 6th case, so the election interference, the federal election interference case. Now, the New York hush money case what the judge could do is impose a sentence and then suspend imposition or when he starts to serve the sentence for after his presidency or when he's no longer president. So he could impose a sentence of, let's say, 6 months or whatever, or he could impose a fine and just suspend imposition of it. So the sentence just sits there and it waits until Donald Trump is amenable to actually serving the sentence. And that's the New York case. Presumably the same thing could happen in Georgia. See, Donald Trump has no control over those two. Now, with the federal cases, this raises the specter of, can Donald Trump pardon himself? Which I think is an utterly absurd reading of the pardon power. I mean, I don't know, if you're having an argument with your significant other and decide to pardon yourself, I'm not sure how far that's going to go. I mean, that's just going to be a problem, right? So the pardon is something you do for somebody else. It's not something you give yourself. But if he wants to push that, it's hard to see what mechanism could challenge it. My guess is Jack Smith, being the careful lawyer that he is, has probably wrapped all of this up in a bow and a package for somebody else to pick up at a later date.
Yeah, I don't think my wife would go for that, Robert. Yeah. I might try it to find out. But in our couple of minutes we have left here, let's talk about the pardons, not just the idea of Donald Trump pardoning himself, but January 6 rioters. Who else are we going to hear from when he moves back into the White House?
Well, he could do that. I think you're going to look for possible pardons of Peter Navarro and Stone. I mean, he already commuted the sentence of Stone. Anybody who's connected with him in his ambit, he's going to think that he should pardon. And that would be really absurd. I mean, these are clear cases of criminal contempt of Congress with the action of Peter Navarro. But if you're Trump's friend, that's all that really matters. And if you join in the kind of Trump litany about the 2020 election, you somehow are beyond reproach. So that's what could happen. The January 6th pardons are very interesting. There is a historical precedent for that. The first use of the pardon power was George Washington with Shays' Rebellion. And this was a protest, although they did not directly challenge democracy itself. But it was a protest, and it was put down. And in a way to kind of quell domestic insurrection and the continuing problems, Washington exercised the pardon power, which, by the way, as Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 74, that is the use of the pardon power to get people past things and go on with the republic. Donald Trump could make that argument. The trouble is, unlike with George Washington, these are all Donald Trump's people, and he probably incited this riot and could be criminally prosecuted himself, which you could never say that about George Washington.
Thanks for listening to the Balance of Power podcast. Make sure to subscribe if you haven't already at Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find us live every weekday from Washington, D.C. at noontime Eastern at Bloomberg.com.